That number. It's in the wrong place. The words came out as softly as a summer breeze, but they brought a sudden stillness to the yard outside Harvard University. July in Cambridge, Massachusetts, draped itself lazily across the red-bricked streets. The leaves of the elm trees rustled gently above Harvard Yard, while the sun spilled down in golden sheets, making everything shimmer with quiet dignity. Among the bustle of tourists and students, nestled at the corner just outside the Johnson Gate, stood a small cart. It wasn't much. A repurposed food cart with wobbly wheels and a hand-painted sign that read, "Gum and tissues. Pay what you can." Behind it, a woman carefully arranged the boxes of breath mints and packs of tissues. Her name was Laura Walker. Next to her sat a girl, thin, pale, 11 years old, with fiery red hair that refused to be tamed. She wore a faded wool sweater that looked better suited for autumn, and scuffed shoes that had been patched more than once. She was writing in a small notebook balanced on her knees. This was Annie. And though she looked out of place beside the grand gates of Harvard, Annie belonged to something deeper than buildings. She belonged to the pursuit of knowledge. Annie had never stepped inside a school after the 5th grade. Her mother, a single parent working 3 jobs, couldn't afford to keep her enrolled. But Annie didn't stop learning. She scavenged textbooks from library dumpsters, collected torn pages from abandoned binders, and taught herself by watching the students who passed by every day. To her, Harvard wasn't a campus. It was a living library, and every passing professor was a page of a book she hadn't read yet. That summer, Harvard Yard buzzed with more energy than usual. Mathematicians from around the world gathered to commemorate the 112th anniversary of the Ramfield conjecture, a legendary math problem unsolved since 1913. To mark the occasion, a massive blackboard was installed outside the Widener Library. Scholars would come up throughout the day, writing notes, drawing diagrams, debating theories in chalk-dusted excitement. To most passers-by, it was a curiosity. To Annie, it was a cathedral. She would sit for hours in the shade, watching them work. She didn't understand every symbol, not yet, but she recognized rhythm, repetition, symmetry. To her, math wasn't abstract. It was language, music. And that afternoon, something broke the tune. A group of 3 graduate students, 2 European, 1 American, were huddled around the board, arguing over a derivation involving Lambert sequences and Ramfield's critical step 47. Annie listened quietly from behind a hedge. She had copied the sequence into her notebook earlier and studied it during lunch. There was something odd about it, something that kept nudging her brain like an itch just under the skin. One of the students reached up and wrote a number near the middle of the formula. 7. Annie tilted her head. She didn't mean to speak, but it slipped out, gentle, almost to herself. "That number, it's in the wrong place." The wind caught the words and carried them. One of the students turned, half amused. "What did you say?" Annie looked up, hesitant. "The 7, she said. "It doesn't fit. The pattern breaks right after it." They stared at her. Then they laughed. "Thanks, Professor. She must be selling equations now, too. You want a gum with that theorem?" Annie flushed and looked down. She stepped back toward her mother's cart, silent. The mockery didn't hurt like it used to, but it still stung. What she didn't see was that someone else had stopped walking. Dr. Matthew Maxwell, assistant professor of applied mathematics, had just stepped out of Widener Library. He had overheard the girl's quiet observation, and something in her tone, not the words but the precision of the words, made him pause. He approached the board. The graduate students had already erased the 7 and moved on. But Maxwell rewrote the expression. He adjusted the step Annie had mentioned. He replaced the 7 with something else, not because he believed her, but because curiosity had always been his compass. He traced the rest of the sequence. Then he stopped. There it was. the symmetry she had sensed, restored. He stood there unmoving as the chatter around the yard softened. One of the graduate students turned to him, puzzled. Another began snapping photos of the board. Maxwell didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment had spoken for itself. Meanwhile, Annie handed a pack of tissues to a passing tourist and sat back down beside her mother. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't see the murmurs start, the glances exchanged, the sudden ripple of curiosity spreading through Harvard Yard like a drop of ink in still water. She just turned another page in her notebook and wrote, Ramfield, Step 47, Revisit Symmetry. That night, rain pattered softly on the tin roof of the apartment where Annie and her mother lived, a cramped third-floor unit just outside the university district. Laura counted what little money they had made, while Annie sat cross-legged on the floor, copying equations from memory. There was a knock at the door. Laura opened it, surprised to see a tall man standing under the hallway light. He held a bicycle helmet in one hand, his shirt damp from the rain. "Excuse me," he said gently. "My name is Dr. B.
Matthew Maxwell. I'm a professor at the university. May I speak to your daughter?"
There are silences that speak louder than words. And that afternoon in Harvard Yard, when the chalk slowed and the laughter died, one of those silences fell. Dr. Matthew Maxwell did not sleep much that night. He spent the evening at his desk in the Science Center, copying out the equation that had been corrected by a girl who sold gum and tissues just outside the gates. He triple-checked the logic. He reran the modular transformation on his laptop and sketched the visual symmetry by hand. It was not luck. It was not a fluke. It was insight. And it came from someone who shouldn't have been there at all. Someone invisible to Harvard's ecosystem of prestige and pedigree. But the mind? The mind had no address. It lived where it wished. The next morning, the yard returned to its routine hum. The blackboard still stood near Widener Library, now cluttered with new chalk lines and signatures from traveling scholars. No one had erased the correction Maxwell made. No one dared. Meanwhile, Annie was back in her usual spot under the elm tree near the gate. She sat with her legs crossed, eating half a peanut butter sandwich. Her notebook was open beside her, covered in looping lines and numbers only she could understand. Every few minutes, she'd glance up at the students walking past. She wasn't watching them. She was watching what they carried. Textbooks, diagrams, ideas. Annie had a habit of solving problems in her head like puzzles she wasn't invited to play with but refused to ignore. At around 11, the 3 graduate students from the day before walked by again. This time, they didn't laugh. One of them glanced at her notebook, then whispered something to the others. They quickened their pace. They were not just embarrassed. They were afraid. Inside Maxwell's office, the tension had already begun. Professor Harold Kent, chair of the Department of Pure Mathematics and a living legend in the field of number theory, had summoned him for an unscheduled meeting. Kent was tall, austere, with a face like weathered marble. His tie was always perfectly knotted, and his sentences came in precise, measured units, as if even conversation required proof. "You edited the public board yesterday," Kent said, not looking up from his desk. "I did," Maxwell replied. "You did so based on an input from a child, a vendor child, with no academic standing, no enrollment, no background." Maxwell hesitated. "That child noticed something I missed, something a lot of us missed." Kent finally raised his eyes. "This is Harvard," he said. "We do not accept insight from sidewalks." Later that afternoon, Maxwell stood at the edge of the yard, watching Annie from a distance. She was showing a younger boy how to fold napkins into triangles. But between the folds, she explained ratios, fractions, the golden mean. Maxwell had spent 15 years studying math. He had a PhD from Princeton. He had published in the Journal of Theoretical Analysis, but nothing had prepared him for the sense of awe he felt when watching this small, barefoot girl rearrange the logic of the world like a deck of cards. He took a deep breath, walked forward, and knelt beside her cart. "Do you want to see what that equation was really about?" he asked. Annie looked at him, unsure. "I don't sell answers," she said. "I'm not buying," he smiled. "Just sharing." The science center felt like another planet to Annie. It smelled like old paper, chalk dust, and cold metal. The boards were taller than she expected, and the bookshelves leaned under the weight of journals older than her mother. Annie stood in the middle of the room, hands in her pockets, eyes wide. On the main blackboard, Maxwell had written the corrected transformation, the one she had suggested. He stood back and let her look. Annie stepped closer. She traced the lines with her eyes. "I thought so," she whispered. "It's not about the number. It's about balance." Maxwell turned. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the structure of the series. "It's like folding. If one side is heavier, the whole thing tips. But if you move the weight—" She paused, looked up at him. "It sings." Maxwell stared at her. There was no arrogance in her tone, no performance, just the quiet certainty of someone who had lived with numbers long enough to hear them speak. He spent the next hour giving her small logic puzzles, truth tables, pattern recognition, even a basic eigenvalue question scribbled on the back of a conference pamphlet. Annie answered each one in silence, then simply nodded when she was finished. Maxwell started to write a fourth problem, but stopped. "She's not guessing," he muttered. "She's seeing." By the time Annie left the building, the sun had dipped behind the bell tower of Memorial Hall. Her mother was waiting outside, arms crossed, worried. "Was he kind?" Laura asked. Annie nodded. "He let me touch the real chalk." Laura smiled faintly, though her eyes lingered on the grand building behind her daughter, as if trying to measure how far they truly were from that world. That night, the whispers grew. A group of students posted a photo of the blackboard online, circling Annie's correction. The caption read, "Genius or just a fluke? You decide." It was shared on a forum, then on a blog, and by morning it had reached a handful of math departments across the country. At breakfast, Annie saw her own name printed, misspelled, on a Twitter post. She didn't have a phone, but Maxwell had printed it out to show her. "Why would people care about this?" she asked, chewing on toast. "Because truth," Maxwell said, "doesn't always come from the expected places." But not everyone agreed. In the staff meeting that followed, Professor Kent made his position clear. "This is not a celebration of raw intellect," he said, his voice hard. "It is a risk to the integrity of our institution. Public rumor over academic rigor." "She corrected a structure we've been debating for decades," Maxwell replied. "She guessed." "No," Maxwell said calmly. "She saw something none of us did." Kent's expression darkened. "Then she should apply. Take our tests, pass our requirements, not play prodigy on the sidewalk." Back outside, Annie returned to her usual spot. The blackboard was still standing. So were the students. But now, when she walked by, the air around her shifted. Not quite respect, not yet, but something different. A pause. A silence. The beginning of something no one could yet name. That evening, as she and her mother packed up the cart, Annie looked up at the great stone buildings around them. "Mom," she asked softly, "do you think a street is still part of the school, even if it's outside the gate?" Laura paused, then pulled Annie close. "I think," she said, "wherever you learn, that's school enough for me." Harvard's Science Center never looked more out of place than when seen from the window of a city bus. Its clean, modern lines, glass panels, and concrete curves rose like a fortress of logic in the middle of centuries-old red brick. But that morning, it wasn't equations or symmetry that lingered in Matthew Maxwell's mind. It was a voice. That number, it's in the wrong place. He hadn't stopped thinking about her. Annie Walker. 11 years old, barely waist-high to him, but with eyes that seemed to carry equations the way a violin carries sound, naturally, beautifully, and without asking permission. After their brief meeting in his office the day before, Maxwell had made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for Harvard's gatekeepers to act. He would go to her. The Walker family lived in a faded brick apartment building just off Mass Ave. 3 floors, no elevator, walls so thin you could hear a neighbor cough 2 rooms away. Apartment 3B was theirs. Laura Walker answered the door, still wearing her vending apron. Her dark brown hair was tied back with a ribbon that had long lost its color. She eyed Maxwell cautiously.
Yes?
Ma'am.
I'm Dr. Matthew Maxwell. I believe we met yesterday. I'd like to speak with your daughter again.
Laura's face tightened, and she stepped halfway into the doorframe.
She didn't do anything wrong, did she?
On the contrary, he smiled. She did something remarkable. Inside the apartment, the air smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner. There was a stack of clothes drying by the window, and the table in the corner was cluttered with half-solved puzzles and torn math pages. Annie appeared from behind a curtain, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her eyes flicked toward Maxwell, curious but cautious.
I'm not in trouble, am I?
Maxwell shook his head. Far from it. I was hoping you might come back to the Science Center. There's more I'd like to show you. Annie hesitated. She looked at her mother. I'd go with her, Maxwell added, and bring her back safely. Laura frowned. What for? Maxwell lowered his voice, sincere. She sees things that most of my students, even some of my colleagues, don't. I don't know what that means yet, but I'd like to find out. Laura looked from him to her daughter and back.
She works, she said quietly. We don't have time for games.
It's not a game, Maxwell said. It's something real. And I think she's earned a chance to walk through the front gate, even if just for an afternoon. And so, Annie walked through Harvard Yard, this time not with gum in her pocket, but with her hands clasped behind her back like a student. Maxwell walked beside her, pointing out buildings, naming professors, describing lectures held beneath the arches of stone and memory. But Annie wasn't looking at buildings. She was looking at patterns. The bricks. The way windows repeated in odd-numbered columns, the sequence of shadows under each arch. Everything to her was math waiting to speak. When they entered the Science Center, Annie's steps slowed. The building was quieter than she expected, less like a laboratory, more like a cathedral. Chalk dust hung in the air like incense. There were no students in this wing today. Maxwell had cleared the space for her visit. He led her to a room lined with blackboards. On one wall, he had replicated a section of the Ramfield conjecture from 1913, not the version in textbooks, but a direct copy from the original manuscript, right down to the old-style variables. Annie tilted her head. Why are the 8s shaped like little snowmen? Maxwell smiled. That's how they wrote them back then, a style from European calligraphy. They're hard to read, she muttered, but kind of pretty. She stepped forward and ran her fingers just above the chalk, tracing the symmetry. Then she paused. Wait, this part. Why is it isolated? Maxwell turned. You mean the grouping in line 6? She nodded. It doesn't do anything, she said. It's just dressing. Maxwell blinked. That's what Ramfield's assistant wrote in his journal. he said. In 1914. Annie shrugged. It wastes time. They worked for an hour. No pressure, no expectations. Just questions and chalk. Maxwell gave her a problem involving square roots and modular primes. She simplified it mentally. Then a game, a grid of dots that formed repeating patterns. It's like tiling, Annie said, but upside down. You mean inverted symmetry? No, she said softly. I mean like when your mom folds your laundry and one sock disappears. Maxwell laughed for the first time in days. He offered her a soda. She declined. She didn't like fizzy things. Instead, they sat by the window, watching a group of freshmen move boxes into a dorm across the courtyard. You know, Maxwell said gently, you don't have to be a professor to be a mathematician. Annie looked up. Then what do you have to be? Maxwell thought for a moment. Curious, relentless, and a little bit kind. Annie nodded slowly, like someone hearing something important but not yet ready to say why it mattered. Outside, as they walked back toward the yard, Maxwell carried Annie's notebook for her. It was worn at the edges, filled with penciled formulas, napkin sketches, and margins crowded with ideas. I'd like to show this to someone, he said. Why? She asked. Because sometimes, he answered, it takes the right eyes to remind the world how blind it can be. When they reached the gate, Laura was waiting. Her eyes flicked from Maxwell to her daughter, trying to read between the lines. Annie smiled and handed her the folded soda napkin, with a small number game written on it. I didn't drink anything, she said, but I did learn why the snowman 8s look funny. Laura looked at Maxwell, her tone softer now. Is this safe? What you're doing? She's the one guiding us, he said. I'm just catching up. That night, Annie lay on her mattress by the window, listening to the sounds of traffic and far-off church bells. She whispered to herself, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Her favorite lullaby, the Fibonacci sequence. She closed her eyes and pictured the pattern in bricks, leaves, domes, fingers, time. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know who would believe her. But for the first time in her young life, a door had opened. Not because she knocked, but because she saw something on the other side that no one else did. Harvard had seen its share of prodigies, but no one quite like her. Annie Walker didn't wear a lab coat. She didn't own a computer. She solved problems with a pencil so short it couldn't be sharpened anymore. And yet, every time she stepped inside Maxwell's office, the air seemed to shift, like the room itself was leaning forward, listening. It had become a quiet routine. Twice a week, after selling tissues and gum with her mother, Annie would walk past the wrought iron gates of Harvard not as a vendor, but as a visitor. She entered through the same side door as before, climbed 2 flights, and sat at the long table beneath the wall of chalkboards. Dr. Maxwell never treated it like a class. There were no tests, no lectures, no raised eyebrows when she didn't know a word. Just questions. And Annie liked questions more than answers. That afternoon, Maxwell handed her a single sheet of paper. 3 short problems. Nothing flashy. No Greek symbols or fancy formatting. Just numbers and letters. She read the first silently. If x plus 3 equals 7, what is x? She blinked at it, looked up. 4. Maxwell smiled. I had to be sure you weren't just pretending to be human. She laughed quietly. The second question, if fn equals fn1 plus fn2, and f0 is 0, f1 is 1, what's f6? Fibonacci, she murmured. 8. Correct, he said. And the third? Annie squinted. This one was longer. In a sequence where the sum of the first n terms equals n squared, what is the nth term? She leaned forward. Wait, that's a trick. She scribbled in her notebook. Maxwell said nothing. He watched her pencil dance, not hesitate, not erase, just move. She looked up, eyes bright. The nth term is second minus 1. He paused. How did you know? I folded the sequence in half, she said, tapping her notebook. You can see the gaps between squares. It's like counting edges. He blinked. Edges? On a square. Each time you add one, it stretches the outside, like sidewalk chalk. You don't add inside, you build from the borders. Maxwell sat back. That metaphor wasn't in any textbook he knew, but it made sense. Beautiful sense. Later, he gave her a harder one. It wasn't from a school book. It was a line pulled from a page of the Ramfield conjecture. He didn't tell her that. He simply drew it. An infinite series, alternating positive and negative fractions, approaching a constant, but undefined at one transition. Annie stared at it for a long time. She tilted her head, then tilted the page. It's lopsided, she said. Maxwell leaned forward. Lopsided how? She pointed to a term halfway through the line. This part loops too early, she said, like you're trying to climb stairs but one's missing. You stumble. He swallowed. That was exactly Ramfield's concern. She turned to him, serious. Why didn't he fix it? Maxwell paused. He didn't know how. Annie looked back at the paper, then softly. Maybe he was looking straight, when he should have looked sideways. Outside, the wind was picking up. Summer was waning. The light in the yard had turned a little more golden, a little more slanted, the way light gets when the world is preparing for autumn. As they left the science center, Maxwell asked, Annie, where did you learn all this? She shrugged. Nowhere. You never had a math teacher? Nope. Books? She nodded. Trash bins near the law school. People throw away smart stuff. He looked down at her. You ever get frustrated? That no one taught you? Annie thought for a while. Then, in a tone so honest it made him stop walking, she said, I don't mind. The numbers don't care where you're from. Back at the apartment that evening, Laura sat at the edge of the bed, listening to her daughter hum softly while flipping through pages. You like this, Professor? Annie nodded without looking up. He asks nice questions. Laura ran a hand through her hair, tired. He thinks you're smart. Annie stopped humming. Do you think I'm smart? Laura looked at her, quiet for a moment, then said, I think you see the world different, and I think the world needs that. Annie smiled, closed her notebook, and crawled under the blanket. But she didn't sleep yet. She lay there, listening to the night, the muffled sounds of the city, the drip of a faucet down the hall, the whisper of numbers moving through her mind like stars across a dark sky. The next morning, Harvard Yard was unusually crowded. A rumor had spread, fast, sharp, and full of questions. The vendor girl is solving the Ramfield problem. No one knew where it came from. Maybe a blog, maybe a tweet, maybe a professor who let it slip. But suddenly, everyone had an opinion. And not all of them were kind. Inside a conference room on the third floor of the math building, several professors were gathered. They were not amused. I understand Maxwell is entertaining her weekly, said Professor Harold Kent. She's a child, replied Professor Lowell from Applied Theory. This borders on unethical. It's not about the girl, Kent said. It's about the circus around her, students gossiping, journalists calling. It undermines our credibility. But what if she's right? Whispered one younger professor. Everyone turned to look at him. The silence that followed was colder than any winter wind. That same day, Annie arrived at the yard, and noticed something different. People were watching her. Not with wonder, not with curiosity, with skepticism, with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, with questions not spoken aloud, but etched across their faces. Who does she think she is? Annie didn't flinch. She walked to her spot beneath the tree, opened her notebook, and began sketching again. But something had changed. The chalk no longer felt weightless. That evening, Dr. Maxwell knocked on their door again. This time, Laura opened it faster. She'd been expecting him. Maxwell looked worried, tired. "They want to test her," he said. "Who?" Laura asked. "The department, the faculty, publicly, in the Sanders Theater." Laura stiffened. "Why?" "To prove that she's not just a story, or to prove that she is." Annie stepped out from behind her mother, holding her pencil like a shield. "Will they laugh?" she asked. Maxwell didn't answer right away, but then quietly, "Maybe, but that doesn't matter." "What does?" "That you show them what you see." And so the stage was set. Not by design, not by fairness, but by doubt. The oldest kind of test in the world. Can the quiet soul hold its ground in a room that doesn't believe in it? Next week, Annie would stand on a stage built for scholars, and the world would watch. Harvard had faced intellectual storms before, rival theories, contested discoveries, debates that stretched across decades. But it had never faced a storm quite like this one. A barefoot girl with a notebook full of numbers and no last name on any record. The news had spread like ivy through brick. The girl from the street, the one with the Ramfield correction. She's going to speak. By the time Monday arrived, posters had already been stapled to bulletin boards, whispered across departments, tweeted under hashtags like #SidewalkGenius and #MathMiracle. Some believed. Most didn't. And some, very quietly, began to prepare for her to fail. Professor Harold Kent was one of those. He stood in the wood-paneled faculty lounge, stirring tea with a rhythm only he could see. "I will not allow sentiment to dismantle rigor," he said flatly. A younger colleague shifted uncomfortably. "She's not asking for admission. She's presenting a pattern." Kent's eyes narrowed. "To present on this campus is to be seen as valid. Every mistake she makes will be ammunition for those already questioning our standards. And if she doesn't make a mistake?" Kent's silence was a warning. At the Science Center, Maxwell sat across from Annie, laying out a chalkboard-sized diagram of the Ramfield sequence. It looked like a spiderweb of numbers, concentric rings of logic, repeating but not quite symmetrical. One segment remained unsolved, the center. "This," he said softly, "is where they want to see you fail." Annie didn't blink. "Because I sell gum?" "Because they don't understand you." She nodded, then pointed to the blank center. "Do you think Ramfield put this here on purpose? To confuse people?" "No," Maxwell said. "I think he got this far and ran out of time." Annie stared at it. "Then maybe it's not meant to be solved with time." Back at home, Laura was pacing. She had worked double shifts all week, her back sore, hands raw. But it wasn't exhaustion that showed on her face. It was fear. "What if they hurt her, Matt?" she asked when Maxwell visited that night. "Not with fists, with words, with looks, with shame. She's stronger than you think. She's still a child." "I know. But the question they're asking isn't about her age. It's about whether truth can come from a sidewalk." The day of the presentation arrived. Sanders Theater, with its high vaulted ceiling, stained glass windows, and worn wooden seats, was more used to concerts and convocations than to 11-year-old girls with frayed shoelaces. But that morning, the place filled early. Professors sat in rows, arms folded. Graduate students whispered predictions. Alumni watched from the back, half amused, half intrigued. And somewhere in the corner, a photographer from a national science journal checked her lens. Backstage, Annie sat on a small bench. She wore a clean sweater, her mother's, and held a pencil so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Maxwell knelt beside her. "You don't have to prove anything," he said.
Yes, I do,
She replied softly.
Why?
She looked up at him.
Because I can see it. And if I don't say it, no one will know it was ever there.
Maxwell nodded, eyes stinging. "You don't need permission to be right," he whispered. Then the doors opened. A quiet fell across the room. Annie stepped onto the stage. She didn't walk fast. She didn't smile. She walked like someone used to being stared at, like someone who'd spent her life being told she was not supposed to be in the room, but had come anyway. She stood on a wooden crate behind the podium, Maxwell's idea, so she could reach the microphone. The blackboard behind her was clean, save for one line written in faint chalk. Ramfield, Step 47, Transition Sequence. Annie turned, picked up a piece of chalk, and said 5 simple words. "It loops before it learns." A murmur ran through the room. She began drawing, not fast, not flashy, just steady, quiet. She sketched the sequence, circled one point and rewrote it, using colors for clarity. She marked the places where the symmetry broke. She showed where the center failed to hold. Then she stepped back. "It's like folding paper," she said. "If you crease too soon, the fold runs crooked." Someone coughed in the front row. A professor leaned forward. Annie continued. "If you wait one more step, just one, the fold meets perfectly. And then..." She turned, drew the final shape, a balanced arc, and stepped away. "It holds." There was silence. Real silence. The kind where every mind in the room is no longer sure of its place. Then, from the back, someone began clapping. Slowly. Another joined, then another. Until the theater echoed with sound. Maxwell didn't move. He watched Annie stand there, small and still as the room clapped for her, not out of pity or novelty, but out of awe. But not all hands clapped. Professor Kent remained seated, arms folded. After the session, he approached Maxwell outside the hall. "Well," he said flatly, "she survived. She did more than that. She made a metaphor. She wrapped the problem in poetry. That's not proof." Maxwell turned to him, calm but firm. "It's a direction," he said. "One that none of us have tried. She has no credentials. And yet, she changed the room." Kent paused, then said the coldest thing he could think of. "She'll never last in this world." To which Maxwell replied, without hesitation, "Then maybe it's the world that needs to change." That night, Annie sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. Her mother wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "You were brave," she said. "I was scared." "That's what makes it brave." Annie looked down at her hands, still covered in chalk dust. "I didn't solve it," she said. "I just saw where it cracked." Laura kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes seeing the crack is the first step to healing the whole thing." Outside, the yard was quiet again. The board had been erased. The stage was empty. But somewhere in the minds of those who had seen her speak, a shift had begun. Small, but sure. Like a breeze before the rain. Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it forgets its own name for a moment. And sometimes it stands on stage with a piece of chalk in one hand and 1,000 eyes watching. 2 days after the Sanders Theater presentation, Harvard's mathematics faculty issued a formal invitation. They called it an open session. It sounded generous, friendly, academic. But Maxwell knew what it really was. A test. Not for understanding, not for equations. A test of worth. Of belonging. And the stakes weren't written on any syllabus. Annie had been quiet since the last presentation, quieter than usual. She didn't talk much that week. She still went to the science center, still filled pages of her notebook with shapes, numbers, ratios, but her eyes moved slower, like the light behind them was flickering. Maxwell noticed. "Are you scared?" he asked her one afternoon. Annie didn't answer right away. Then, staring down at her shoes, she whispered, "I think I'm a mistake." Maxwell knelt down beside her. "Why?" "Because I don't know all their words." "You don't need their words." "But they use them like doors." He nodded. "That's true. But sometimes a window opens instead." The open session was scheduled for Friday at noon. It would be held inside the department hall, a chamber built for doctoral defenses and visiting lectures. Not many chairs, but all of them would be filled. Professors, students, journalists, and somewhere, hidden between the lines, judgment. Laura Walker held her daughter's hand as they walked through Harvard Yard. The cart was closed for the day. Maxwell had insisted. "You need to rest before your test," he'd told Annie. "But I still have to work," she had replied. Maxwell had looked at Laura, who only said, "Maybe today she can work in a different way." Inside the hall, Annie stood beside the blackboard. She was given no prompt, no prep. Just this. Present your understanding of the Ramfield sequence. Maxwell sat to the side, hands clasped. He wasn't allowed to help. Neither was anyone else. Annie held the chalk like it might break. She drew one line, then another, then paused. There were so many people, some whispering, some smirking. One camera, one flash. Her hand began to shake. She erased the second line, then the first. Her face turned pale. She stepped back from the board. Someone coughed. Someone else scribbled a note. Maxwell's heart cracked. Annie turned to the room and said, barely audible, "I forgot what I was doing." A ripple of confusion ran through the crowd. She lowered her head, and for a moment, just a moment, it looked like she might walk away. But then she looked up, not at the professors, not at the chalkboard. She looked at her hands, still stained with dust, still carrying the weight of hours spent folding napkins, counting change while writing on grocery receipts. She closed her eyes and remembered. A voice came back to her. Her mother's voice. On a long-ago day in the middle of summer, when sales were low and hunger was high. "Selling on the street takes quick math too, Annie. You've got it in you." She opened her eyes, and this time, she didn't write an equation. She drew a spiral. At first, no one understood, but then she spoke, gently, clearly. "This is what happens when you add 1 and 1, then 1 and 2, then 2 and 3, then 3 and 5. She drew another spiral. "It's not numbers, it's movement. The Ramfield sequence isn't just a formula, it's a turn, a rhythm." She stepped back. When you walk too soon, it breaks. When you wait too long, it misses. But if you follow the curve, it leads you somewhere. Maxwell's throat tightened. He watched the board fill not with theory, but with insight. Not with memorized names, but with vision. Annie pointed to the spot where the spiral intersected the center. This is where I see the answer. It doesn't close because it's not supposed to. It continues. Someone in the front row leaned forward. A graduate student whispered, "She's mapping it geometrically." A professor murmured, "That's a dynamic system interpretation." And still, Annie spoke simply. Maybe Ramfield couldn't finish it because he was trying to build a wall. But it's not a wall. It's a door. For a long moment, the room said nothing. Then an older professor stood. He didn't speak. He just nodded. Another stood beside him. Then a third. The room didn't erupt in applause, but something greater happened. They listened. Later in the hallway, as the crowd began to leave, Maxwell joined Annie and Laura. Neither mother nor daughter said anything at first. Then Laura turned to her. "You scared them." Annie looked up. "Was that bad?" "No," Laura smiled. "It means they finally saw you." That night, Annie didn't go straight to bed. She stood by the window, notebook open, scribbling more spirals, more sequences. She had ideas now, not answers, but directions. She had crossed a threshold, not one the world had built, but one she built herself. Back at Harvard, someone erased the blackboard. But they didn't erase what happened. In the minds of those who watched, a quiet question now remained. What if truth really can come from the sidewalk? And in Annie's mind, another question began to grow. If I can see this, what else might I see? Harvard Yard was quieter now. The cameras had gone. The murmurs had quieted. The chalkboards had been wiped clean. But for Annie Walker, something had changed permanently. Not on the outside, on the inside. She no longer wondered if she belonged. Now she wondered what came next. The answer came 2 days later, in a thick white envelope with gold lettering. It wasn't addressed to a parent. It wasn't addressed to Harvard. It was addressed simply to Miss Annie Walker, Dr. Matthew Maxwell, Harvard Science Center. Inside was an embossed letter, the kind that smelled faintly of cologne and old leather. The heading read, "The Hamilton Institute for Mathematical Talent, an invitation to greatness." Maxwell stared at the letter, jaw clenched. He'd heard of them. Everyone in the field had. The Hamilton Institute was a privately funded program backed by a powerful American foundation. It had deep pockets, deep ambitions, and a quiet reputation for buying up young minds. They offered full academic sponsorships, elite mentorship, travel, housing, and, for the family, financial relief that most couldn't refuse. In return, students agreed to a very specific condition. All intellectual property produced under the program became property of the Institute. The letter was glowing. "We have followed Annie's extraordinary emergence with admiration. We would be honored to invite her into our special scholars cohort, beginning immediately. All expenses will be covered. A private apartment for her and her mother is available should relocation be needed. We are ready to open doors the world could not." Maxwell put the letter down. He already felt the chill. He met Annie and her mother at their usual sidewalk bench. It was late afternoon. The light was golden. The cart was nearly empty. Just a few packs of gum and a paper cup with quarters. Maxwell handed Laura the envelope first. She read it slowly. By the time she reached the second page, her hands were shaking. "Is this real?" she asked. Maxwell nodded. "Yes. It's everything we don't have." "I know." She looked at Annie. "Honey, they'd give us a home. Not just a classroom. A home." Annie was silent. She didn't touch the envelope. That night, the apartment felt heavier than usual. The air didn't move. The windows wouldn't open all the way. Laura folded laundry in silence. Annie sat on the floor with her notebook open, but she hadn't written a single line in over an hour. Finally, she asked, Would we still live near Harvard? Laura shook her head. No, baby, it's in Chicago, a long way from here. Annie nodded, then whispered, Would I still get to use Dr. Maxwell's chalkboards? I don't know. Annie looked at the blank page in front of her. I don't think I'd like someone owning my thinking. Laura turned to her. What do you mean? Annie stared at her hands. They said all the stuff I think would belong to them. That's just how those things work, Laura said gently. They're giving us everything. But what if I need to change my mind? The next morning, Maxwell found Annie sitting alone on the front steps of the Science Center. The letter was folded in her lap. She didn't look up as he approached. Is it a trap? She asked. He didn't answer at first, then slowly. It's a castle with no doors. Annie blinked. Then why do people say yes? Because the world is hard, and safety feels like a miracle. Would you say yes? Maxwell sighed. When I was your age, yes. Today, no. Annie looked up at him. Then why did they send it? Because they see your light, but they don't want to follow it. They want to bottle it. That afternoon, the three of them sat in a booth at a small diner near Central Square. Maxwell had brought hot chocolate. Laura had brought questions. What would happen if we said yes? She asked. They'd move you out of state, Maxwell said. You'd live in an apartment. Annie would get one-on-one instruction, but all her work would be published under their name. She'd sign non-disclosure agreements. They'd own her direction. And if we say no, she keeps everything she creates. But she doesn't get security, or guaranteed shelter, or sponsorship. Not yet. Laura looked down at her daughter. I'm tired, Annie, she whispered. Tired of scraping by. Annie reached across the table and held her hand. I know, Mama. Laura wiped a tear. I don't want to be selfish. I just want you safe. Annie's voice was soft, but steady. I don't want to be owned. I want to be free. Maxwell didn't speak. He just looked at Annie, this 11-year-old who somehow knew what most adults spent a lifetime trying to figure out. That the hardest prison is the one built with comfort, and the rarest kind of genius is the one that walks away from it. They declined the offer, politely, firmly. Annie wrote the letter herself, by hand. Thank you for seeing something in me, but I need to keep walking the way I see. Maybe one day we'll meet on the same road, but I can't turn off mine to follow yours. Sincerely, Annie Walker. The Hamilton Institute didn't reply. They didn't need to. But a week later, something strange happened. A professor from another university, one who had seen Annie's presentation at Harvard, sent her a copy of her own spiral diagram, printed in a research newsletter. No credit, no mention, just taken. Maxwell stormed into the department head's office. This is theft. It's academia, came the flat reply. Maxwell didn't back down. It's also a child. They fought the case. It didn't go far, but it went far enough. The newsletter issued a correction. Quiet, buried, but real. Original pattern attributed to A. Walker, independent scholar, Cambridge, M.A. 3 lines. But for Annie, it felt like 3 mountains. That night, she and her mother sat on the curb near the yard, watching the sunset reflect off the Harvard bricks. We said no, Laura said softly. And now, we've got nothing. Annie shook her head. We have something. What? She smiled. My name, and the next idea. Somewhere inside Harvard Yard, under the weight of 10,000 books, a secret waited. Not one sealed in a vault, not one hidden by malice, but a secret born of silence, and left unread for over 100 years. That night, a girl named Annie Walker walked toward it. It was well past midnight. The lamps in the yard flickered like tired eyes, and the last of the students had long gone home. Rain had just stopped, leaving the stone paths slick and glistening. Annie moved like a shadow. In one pocket, a folded library map. In the other, a small flashlight and a single square of chocolate, a gift from Maxwell. He didn't know she was coming here. No one did. Widener Library stood like a cathedral in the night. Its steps stretched wide and proud, its stone columns worn smooth by a century of scholars. Annie had always looked at it from the outside, feeling both awe and ache. But tonight, she had something else. A name. R. Ramfield, Manuscript Notes, 1911. Archival Room C, lower level. She'd overheard 2 visiting mathematicians mention it earlier that week. Something about original annotations that had never been digitized. The conversation had passed quickly. To them, it was trivia. To Annie, it was a trailhead. A retired librarian named Mr. Hollis had once given Annie a whisper-thin tip. If you're ever curious, child, the past has its own staircase. She'd thought it was a metaphor. Now she realized it was real. At the back of the building, behind a Latin-engraved door she'd never noticed before, was an old service entrance. She pushed. It opened with a soft groan, like a book's first page turning. Inside, the air changed. Cool. Still. Dust that didn't move unless you did. She followed the basement map through narrow hallways and under low ceilings. Paint peeled in places. Light bulbs buzzed faintly. Most doors were locked, but not Room C. She pushed it open and stepped into a forgotten archive. Rows of wooden drawers lined the walls. There were no glowing screens, no polished marble, just boxes, folders, ink-stained paper. The room smelled of ink, leather, and a kind of hush that only comes when no one has spoken for decades. She found the file marked Ramfield, Richard, Working Notes, 1910 to 1913. It was heavier than she expected. She sat on the floor and opened it. Inside were diagrams, hand-drawn, delicate, almost fragile. Some pages were torn, others covered in smudged annotations. Most of it was familiar, the same equations she'd seen on Maxwell's boards. But tucked between 2 loose pages was something different. Not math. A letter. Not to a colleague, not to a journal. It was addressed in old-fashioned cursive, to the next pair of eyes. Annie held her breath. She read, "If you are reading this, it means I never found it. I have tried symmetry, I have tried approximation, I have tried to let the numbers speak, but I have failed to hear the answer clearly. I believe now I approached the conjecture in the wrong dimension. Not depth, not time, but something I cannot name. Perhaps someone without my training will see what I was too learned to find." It was signed simply, R.R. Annie's fingers trembled. A grown man, a scholar, once the pride of a generation, had ended his life's work in a whisper of surrender. And he had left it for a stranger, not a peer, not a student, anyone. Even a girl who sold gum by the gate. She turned back to the diagrams. This time, she didn't look for logic. She looked for shape. She tilted the page, then rotated it. The sequence looked like a spiral when turned, but the numbers curved unevenly, almost like the image was incomplete. She flipped another page. There, in the corner of one of Ramfield's sheets, was a faint sketch, faded with age. A series of folded arcs, drawn like napkin creases, not labeled, not explained, but unmistakably familiar. Annie had drawn the exact same thing 2 weeks ago. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her notebook. Side by side, her spiral and Ramfield's were nearly identical. Only his was missing a final fold. Annie drew it in. Suddenly the loops aligned, not a closed circle, but a path. A continuous arc that bent but never broke. A line that invited Ben, not solved, but opened. She stayed there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, copying everything by hand. No camera, just pencil, paper, and breath. By the time she looked up, the sun was beginning to press against the window well above the hallway. She packed the notes into her bag. Before leaving, she placed the original letter carefully back where she found it. But she added one small note of her own, just beneath Ramfield's signature. I saw it. Thank you for looking. A. Walker. She slipped out of the building just as the janitor was unlocking the front steps. Nobody saw her. Nobody stopped her. And yet, she carried with her something no one else in the world knew. The Ramfield conjecture wasn't just a problem. It was a mirror, one that could only be read sideways, upside down, or perhaps by someone who had never been taught which direction was right. When Maxwell saw her later that morning, he immediately noticed the change in her eyes. "What did you find?" he asked. Annie didn't answer at first. She just opened her notebook, laid it in front of him, and said, "I think he was waiting for someone who folds things like I do." Maxwell sat in silence, scanning the patterns. Then he looked at her. "You found his missing step." Annie shook her head. "No, he never missed it. He just couldn't believe something so simple could be part of something so hard." Maxwell whispered, "That's all of life, isn't it?" Annie smiled. That night she slept early. No flashlight, no notebook, just dreams. Of folds, of spirals, of a man from another century, smiling at her from a place no equation could reach. Truth doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes in the form of a child, stepping onto a stage with her shoelaces undone. The ballroom at the National Mathematics Conference in Washington, D.C. was grand and cold. Carpeted floors, tall ceilings, rows of scientists seated in tight clusters. The kind of space built for breakthrough announcements, not for children. The annual keynote session was always the same. Someone from MIT, Princeton, Stanford. A known name, a confident voice, a polished slide deck. This year, however, the schedule held a strange addition. Special session, Rethinking the Ramfield Conjecture, a Geometric Proposal. Speaker, A. Walker, independent scholar, Cambridge, M.A. No bio, no degree, no photo, just a name. Dr. Buy-in. Matthew Maxwell had arranged it in secret. Not for attention, not for headlines, but because he believed Annie's spiral, that delicate folding path born from intuition, dust, and late nights, was the closest anyone had come to seeing the Ramfield problem, not just solving it. Annie didn't want to go at first. "I don't belong in a ballroom," she'd said. "You belong wherever the truth needs a voice," Maxwell had replied. And so she went. She wore a borrowed dress and her usual shoes. Her mother had packed her notebook in a lunchbox. She carried it like armor. Inside the ballroom, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she walked toward the stage. Whispers rose like steam. "Is this a mistake?" "She's a child." "Is this the opening act?" Annie ignored them all. She climbed the 2 wooden steps to the stage. She didn't speak. She drew. At the center of the blackboard, she placed a simple, hand-drawn spiral. Not perfect, but alive. She turned to the audience and said, "The Ramfield sequence doesn't break. It turns." A murmur. She continued, "When you treat it like a staircase, you fall off the edge. But when you treat it like a fold, like a rhythm, it begins to hold together." She stepped to the side, drawing curved lines between terms of the sequence. She circled the part Ramfield could never balance, Step 47. "This isn't an error," she said. "It's a door." And he almost walked through it. A hand rose in the audience. Professor Keene from Yale. "Are you saying this entire century of work missed a turn?" Annie nodded, calm. "I think they were too close to the numbers. They forgot the shape." Another hand. Dr. Patel from UC Berkeley. "You're describing the conjecture like a topological surface, a Mobius fold?" Annie looked at her notebook. "I don't know that word, but I think so." Maxwell, standing in the wings, smiled. Annie took a breath, then opened her notebook. She flipped to the page she'd copied by hand from the Widener archives, the page with Ramfield's final spiral sketch. And next to it, her correction. Not a solution, but a suggestion. What if the loop isn't meant to close? What if the proof lives in the fact that it keeps folding forever, like a shell? The room changed. The quiet that followed wasn't polite. It was stunned. Not because Annie had solved the Ramfield conjecture. She hadn't. But because she'd done something rarer. She'd seen it. With eyes untouched by ego, untouched by tradition. She'd seen what the mathematicians had buried under 10 decades of method and formality. And she'd reminded them that seeing was the beginning of truth. A hand at the very back of the room lifted. An old man. Thin. White hair. Cane against his chair. "I was Ramfield's student assistant," he said softly. "Long ago." The room turned. The man pointed at Annie. "You drew what he could never explain. He talked of spirals. He folded napkins when he was stuck. But no one ever took him seriously." He paused, then added, "I think." He was waiting for her. The audience stood, not all at once, but slowly, with something close to reverence. There was no thunder, no orchestra, no sweeping announcement, just standing. Because sometimes that's how a room admits it's been changed. Backstage, Annie sat in a folding chair holding her pencil between her fingers like it was glass. Maxwell crouched beside her. "You did it." She shook her head. "No, I didn't finish it." "That's not what I mean," he said. "You reminded them how to wonder." A journalist approached Maxwell later that day. "What's next for her?" they asked. He looked toward Annie, sitting on the floor eating a sandwich with her mother. "I don't know," he said. "But I know the world just got quieter, because it's listening now." That night, on the train ride back to Boston, Annie sat by the window. The spiral diagram rested in her lap. Her mother slept against her shoulder. Out the window, the dark trees blurred past. The stars above blinked faintly. She didn't feel proud or famous. She felt clear. The way a glass feels when it's just been washed, empty but ready. When they arrived at the station, a small group of students were waiting, strangers to Annie but carrying signs. Not big ones, just quiet ones. "Truth has no address. Thank you for folding the door open. Math needs dreamers too." Annie smiled, then turned to her mother and said, "Let's go home, Mom. I think I still owe you a shift at the cart." It didn't end in a lab, not in a lecture hall or with a prize or on the cover of a magazine. It ended where it began, on the same brick sidewalk outside Harvard Yard, where a girl once whispered, "That number, it's in the wrong place." Autumn arrived in Cambridge with gold and quiet. The yard rustled with the sound of dry leaves and freshman voices. The columns of Widener Library stood solemn, watching over the walkways like old giants who had seen too much and finally learned to listen. A few months had passed since the conference. And Annie Walker? She was exactly where she wanted to be. She had said no to the Hamilton Institute again. To every private contract, every tech foundation, every brand offering to sponsor her journey. They promised her devices, tutors, tours. She promised them silence. Maxwell had supported her completely. "You don't owe them your mind," he said. "You only owe it your care." Annie had nodded, drawing another spiral in the corner of her page. Not a closed one, a living one. She accepted something else instead. The Open Scholars Program, a quiet, flexible scholarship designed for non-traditional students who wanted to learn without surrendering their independence. They gave her a small desk inside the Science Center, full access to the Widener archives, and the one thing no one else had offered her: freedom. But Annie still came back to the sidewalk every afternoon. The cart hadn't changed much. Laura still sold gum, tissues, and once in a while, coffee. But now, beside it, stood something new. A small table, a folding chair, and a chalkboard on wheels. Above it, a hand-painted sign: Math from the Street. Lessons for anyone curious. Free. Or pay in kindness. It began quietly. At first, just a few children, local kids whose parents worked night shifts or lived in shelters nearby. Then a curious tourist, a retired janitor, a graduate student who had failed algebra twice. Annie taught without books. She folded napkins to teach symmetry, used sidewalk chalk to trace ratios in the bricks, counted footsteps between gates to explain distance formulas, and when someone got frustrated, she'd say, "Maybe try folding it the other way." People started coming not for answers, but for the way she made the questions gentler. One afternoon, Professor Harold Kent walked by. He hadn't spoken to Annie since the Sanders presentation. He had written no letters, offered no praise, but now he stood near the cart, hands behind his back, watching as she explained prime numbers using colored marbles. He cleared his throat. Annie looked up. "Hello, Professor." He nodded. "You've created quite the sidewalk." She smiled. "Still learning." He hesitated. Then, "Ramfield would have liked this." Annie shrugged. "Maybe." He took a breath. "You're not interested in returning inside the gates?" "I am inside," she said softly. He blinked and left without another word. That night at home, Laura sat at the table, writing her first rent check in 5 years with a hand that didn't shake. Annie sat across from her, copying notes from a 1912 journal she'd found in the library basement. There were no interviews, no flashes, no headlines, just the quiet sound of two women building a life. The next spring, something unexpected happened. Harvard, for the first time in its history, created a fellowship in Annie's name. The Walker Fellowship for Unconventional Inquiry. It was small, modest, but meaningful. Maxwell called it a lighthouse for other minds lost at sea. Annie, when told, just asked, "Will the fellows have to wear shoes?" "No," Maxwell grinned, "but they will need pencils." On the last day of May, as graduation filled the yard with robes and parents, Annie sat by her cart, as always. She drew a spiral on her chalkboard. A tourist passed by, reading the sign. "Are you that girl?" Annie looked up. "No," she said. "I'm just this girl." Then she offered the woman a piece of gum. The world didn't change that day. But a few people did. And the sidewalk? It kept folding forward. One step, one question, one child at a time. Because in the end, it wasn't the gates of Harvard that made Annie Walker remarkable. It was the way she stood just outside them and still let the world in. Final scene. The chalkboard at dusk, lit by a golden street lamp. Faint writing remains. Math is just a way of saying, I see you, world. A breeze lifts the edge of the page. The spiral continues. Thank you, deeply and truly, for walking with Annie Walker, for sitting with her on the sidewalk, for listening to her silences, for seeing her, not for what she lacked, but for what she carried. Wonder, humility, and a mind wide open to the world. This story wasn't just about numbers. It was about belonging. Even when the world says you shouldn't. About choosing integrity over applause, and about remembering that genius doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it wears old shoes and sells gum outside a red brick gate. To every soul who stayed with Annie from chapter 1 to chapter 10. You weren't just listening to her story. You were helping her be heard. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. For believing in small voices, for honoring quiet brilliance, and for knowing that sometimes the warmest light comes from the humblest flame. We'll meet again on another sidewalk, with another story and another child, reaching for the stars with chalk-stained hands.